Back off! Right now! That's your last warning!
Nurse Mallory Keene didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. 3 soldiers were blocking her path in the trauma bay, laughing because she was just a nurse. They had no idea who they were standing in front of them. Mallory Keene had spent years as a classified combat medic inside one of the most covert units in the U.S. military. She had kept that life buried for nearly a decade. She saved the soldier they came with. The attending physician called it insubordination. One of those 3 men filed a formal complaint against her. Hours later, a senior military colonel walked into Briarwood Regional not to investigate her, but to tell her she was the only person in the building who could save a dying man. If you want to hear stories about people who are quietly extraordinary, the ones no one sees coming, subscribe to this channel. There's a lot more where this came from. Now let's get into it. Briarwood Regional Medical Center had a rhythm to it, the kind that most people never noticed unless they worked there long enough to feel it in their bones. The early shift moved fast gurneys overhead, pages the sharp smell of antiseptic cutting through recycled air. Mallory Keene had learned that rhythm within her first 2 weeks. 11 months later, she could read a room before she walked through the door. She was 33 years old, and she had learned long ago that being quiet was not the same as being absent. She did her job without drawing attention to herself, which was exactly what she intended. Her colleagues knew her as precise, steady, and difficult to rattle a nurse who didn't complain and didn't make mistakes. That was enough. That was all she needed them to know. Dr. Everett Baines ran the trauma department the way certain men run things when they believe their authority is the most important thing in the room. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had probably been impressive at 40 and had since confused that past impression with a permanent fact. He had a habit of speaking to nurses the way someone speaks to furniture, not cruelly, but without the expectation of a real response. What his colleagues didn't know, and what the hospital's HR file certainly didn't reflect, was that Baines had once been a senior military physician, credentialed, decorated, and by all formal accounts, a man with a significant future in military medicine. That future had ended in 2009, quietly, and without public explanation, when he was forced into early retirement following an incident that had been handled internally and sealed. He had not forgiven the institution that signed that order. He had simply waited and found a different way to settle the account. Mallory had worked under doctors like him before. She kept her head down and her reports accurate, and most days that was enough to stay invisible. What none of her colleagues knew, what she had made certain no one would find, was that the version of herself she brought to Briarwood Regional was a carefully edited one. Her civilian employment file was clean and unremarkable. It listed her training, her certifications, her previous hospital placement. It did not mention the 7 years she had spent embedded with the 7th Special Operations Support Command, operating in environments where the difference between a correct decision and a hesitation was measured in whether someone came home breathing. That chapter of her life existed in a file somewhere behind a classification level that most people in this building didn't have the clearance to know existed. She had left that life deliberately. Not because she'd been broken by it, though it had cost her things she didn't allow herself to name on ordinary days, but because she had made a decision that she wanted to know what it felt like to have a Tuesday that meant nothing. A morning that didn't begin with a threat assessment. She had moved to Alder Ridge, rented a small apartment 2 miles from the hospital, and started running 6 miles every morning before her shift. It was a quiet life. She had been building it carefully for nearly a year. Then the call came over the radio just after 11 in the morning. Multiple vehicle accident on State Route 17, military convoy involved casualties incoming. The trauma bay shifted into controlled urgency. Mallory had already reviewed the incoming patient list by the time the first gurney came through the doors. A staff sergeant mid-30s, breathing labored and deteriorating fast. She could hear it before she had the chart in her hand. The diminished breath sounds on the left side, the tracheal deviation, the way his neck veins were distending. Tension, pneumothorax. The air was compressing his heart with every breath he took, and if the pressure wasn't released in the next few minutes, his body would simply stop being able to compensate. Baines had been paged, but hadn't appeared. Mallory pulled the decompression kit from the supply cart, positioned herself, and prepared to act. That was when the doors burst open. Gunnery Sergeant Nolan Gresham came in fast, the way men trained for breach entries come through doors, like the room was supposed to respond to their arrival. 2 junior soldiers flanked him. His eyes found Mallory's hands first, then moved up to her face, then to the badge clipped to her chest. "Step back," he said. "Where's the doctor?" "He's been paged. The patient can't wait." Mallory didn't look up from what she was doing. "I'm not asking you to make that call." His voice had the particular edge of someone who believed rank solved every problem faster than reasoning. "You're a nurse. Move aside." She looked at him directly then. The monitor behind her was screaming, "Back off, right now. That's your last warning." One of the soldiers laughed a short, dismissive sound. Nolan crossed his arms and held his ground. Neither of them moved. Mallory turned back to the patient and completed the decompression. The needle went in, the pressure released, and within 90 seconds, the staff sergeant's oxygen saturation began climbing back toward a survivable number. She worked without speaking, without hurrying, without any of the visible anxiety that might have suggested she wasn't certain of every single thing she was doing. By the time Baines arrived in the doorway, 6 minutes after the patient had entered the room, the crisis had passed. The sergeant was stable. Mallory was charting. Baines looked at the patient, looked at Mallory, looked at the used decompression kit on the tray. "Who authorized this?" he asked. "There was no time to wait," Mallory said. "That is not how this department operates." His voice was controlled, which somehow made it worse than shouting. He was the kind of man who used calm the way others use a door slamming. "You do not perform invasive procedures without physician oversight. This is insubordination, and I will be documenting it." Nolan Gresham was already pulling out his phone. The formal complaint landed in the hospital administrator's inbox before the end of the shift. Baines moved quickly. By the following morning, Mallory had been reassigned from the trauma bays to Bay 5, a low-acuity overflow area where the most critical thing she'd likely encounter was a sprained ankle or a mild allergic reaction. He framed it as a precautionary measure pending review. The language in the memo was careful, institutional, airtight. He had clearly done this kind of thing before. The disciplinary meeting was scheduled for 2 days out. Mallory was informed that she would be expected to account for the technical proficiencies she had demonstrated, which did not appear in her employment file. That was the part that had no clean answer. She could explain herself, but any explanation thorough enough to satisfy the panel would require opening a door she had spent nearly a year trying to keep sealed. If she stayed silent, she looked incompetent or reckless. If she told the truth came with consequences she hadn't agreed to. She spent the first night thinking through her options and arrived at the same conclusion each time there wasn't a good one. The second night changed the question entirely. Camille Serrano called at 10:47. They had served 2 deployments together, and Camille now worked in a logistics coordination role at Fort Redmond, 40 miles northeast of Alder Ridge. She didn't call often. When she did, it wasn't for small talk. "There's been an incident on Route 17, Camille said. "Second one. A convoy unit was hit different from the first. The device wasn't just explosive. There's a chemical component, and it's bad. They're routing the casualties to Briarwood." Mallory sat up. "How many?" "Enough. And Mallory, the unit that got hit. I recognized 2 of the names on the manifest." Camille's voice didn't waver, but something in it tightened. People who know you. People who will recognize you the moment they're conscious enough to say your name. The quiet life. 6 miles every morning. A Tuesday that meant nothing. When do they arrive? Mallory asked. You've got maybe 30 minutes. She could have stayed home. She had technically been reassigned. She was not scheduled to be in the trauma bay, and there were grounds, professional, bureaucratic, self-protective grounds to let the night shift handle it. Baines would have preferred it. Anyone building a case against her would have preferred it. Mallory put on her jacket and drove to the hospital. The emergency department was already in mass casualty mode when she arrived. The overhead lights were at full intensity. The corridors were dense with staff, and the noise was the particular kind of organized noise that happens when a system is being pushed past its comfortable limits. She could see it in the way people were moving faster than usual with slightly wider eyes. She badged in and walked toward the trauma corridor. A charge nurse named Donna Ashworth caught her at the entrance to the main bay. Donna was competent and straightforward, and she had never been unkind to Mallory, but right now she had a look on her face that mixed relief with reluctance. "You're not supposed to be in there," Donna said. "I know," Mallory said. She kept walking. No one stopped her. Bay 1 had a soldier on the table who was not responding the way a blast injury patient should respond. His heart rate was dropping when it should have been elevated. His blood pressure was in free fall. The resident on duty had ordered the standard trauma protocol and was watching it fail in real time, the confusion on his face visible and worsening by the second. Mallory stood in the doorway and looked at the patient. She didn't look at the monitor first. She looked at the patient's skin, his muscle fasciculations, the way his pupils had constricted to near pinpoints under the bay lighting. Then she smelled it, faint, almost buried under the antiseptic and the metallic scent of blood, but there. Something that didn't belong to a blast injury. She crossed the room. "He's been exposed to a nerve agent," she said. "Organophosphate compound. The protocol you're running is going to make this worse." The resident looked at her badge. "You're from Bay 5. "I am," she said, "and I'm telling you what I'm seeing. The attending is Dr. Baines, and he has not—" "Then page him again," Mallory said. "And while you're waiting, look at this patient's pupils and tell me the last time you saw blast trauma present like this." The resident looked at the patient. He looked for a long time. Then he paged Baines. Baines arrived in under 4 minutes, which told Mallory he had been close. He saw her immediately, and his expression did something complicated, tightening around the eyes in a way that wasn't just annoyance. She laid out what she observed methodically. The symptom cluster, the smell, the pattern of deterioration, the intervention she was recommending. "This is not within your scope," Baines said. "The patient is going to arrest in the next 3 to 4 minutes if we don't change course. I will not have—" The monitor alarm cut through everything. The patient's pressure bottomed out. The resident was already looking at Baines for direction, and for one long, visible moment, Baines had nothing to give him. "Do it," Baines said finally. The words came out like something being dropped from a height. Mallory ran the modified protocol. Atropine pralidoxime sequenced and timed the way she had done it, in conditions far less controlled than this one. The patient's vitals began to stabilize within 8 minutes. She was still writing the documentation when Colonel Leona Barrett walked into the bay. Barrett was in her early 50s, short-haired with the kind of posture that didn't come from military training alone, but from decades of being the person in the room everyone else deferred to. She had 2 officers behind her, and a look on her face that suggested she already knew exactly where she was going and who she was looking for. She didn't ask for Baines. She didn't ask for the medical director or the administrator on call. She looked across the bay and found Mallory standing at the charting station. "Keene," she said. It was the first time anyone at Briarwood Regional had called her by her last name without the word nurse in front of it. It was the first time in 11 months that anyone here had said her name as though it meant something specific. Mallory looked up. "We need you," Barrett said. "There's a major in Bay 3 who is running out of time, and you are the only person in this building who has the background to keep him alive." Baines was standing 10 feet away. He heard every word. The expression on his face shifted again, not to surprise but to something harder and more guarded, the look of a man recalculating something he thought he had already settled. Mallory set down her pen and walked toward Colonel Barrett. She didn't look back. Major Adrian Rourke was 41 years old and looked in that moment like a man being taken apart from the inside. His skin had gone the color of old wax. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven intervals, and the readout above his bed was a series of numbers that told the same story in a language Mallory didn't need to translate. She had seen this before, not in a hospital, but in a field in conditions where there was no Bay 3, no overhead lighting, no crash cart within reach. She had kept men alive in those conditions with less than what she had here. She moved to the bedside and began her assessment without preamble, reading his body the way she had been trained to read a situation, not starting with the chart, but starting with the patient himself. The muscle tremors, the excessive secretions, the way his diaphragm was beginning to fight against his own autonomic system. Organophosphate toxicity more advanced than the soldier in Bay 1. Whoever had engineered the device on Route 17 had known what they were doing. Colonel Barrett stood near the door watching without interfering. That was something Mallory noted and appreciated. Barrett understood the difference between oversight and obstruction, which put her ahead of most people Mallory had worked under in the past year. She called for atropine and pralidoxime in specific doses, and the Bay 3 nurse, a younger man named Tyler Marsh, moved to pull them without hesitation. Mallory walked him through the sequencing carefully and clearly. When Dr. Baines appeared in the doorway 12 minutes later, flanked by Dr. Malcolm Dwyer, the hospital's deputy medical director, Mallory was already into the second phase of the protocol. "This patient is under my department's care," Baines said. "He is," Mallory agreed without looking up. "And I'm keeping him alive while your department catches up." Dwyer started to say something about scope of practice and chain of authorization, his voice carrying the particular tone of an administrator who had confused procedural language with medical judgment. Barrett turned and looked at him. She didn't speak. Dwyer stopped talking. Baines stayed in the room. He watched Mallory work with an expression she couldn't fully read, not the open contempt he had shown her the night before, but something more contained, something that looked less like anger and more like calculation. She filed that away and kept her attention on Adrian. Over the next hour, Adrian Rourke's numbers moved slowly, incrementally, towards something sustainable. He wasn't out of danger. The compound had been in his system long enough to create secondary effects that would need monitoring, but he was no longer losing ground. Mallory adjusted the protocol twice based on how he was responding, and both times she explained her reasoning aloud to Tyler, so there would be no ambiguity in the record. When Adrian's vitals had stabilized enough for Barrett to step closer to the bed, she looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at Mallory. "His file is classified at a level above this facility's clearance," Barrett said, "as is yours." "I know," Mallory said. "Your employment record here doesn't reflect your actual training. Not even close." Barrett said it matter-of-factly, without drama, the way someone states a fact that has already been verified. 7 years with the 7th SOSC, 3 combat deployments, specialized certification in chemical and biological casualty management that less than 40 people in the entire country hold. She glanced toward the doorway where Baines had been standing. He was gone. The people who scheduled your disciplinary meeting tomorrow morning don't know any of that, but they're about to. The disciplinary meeting convened the following morning in the third-floor conference room, and it lasted approximately 9 minutes before it stopped being a disciplinary meeting. Deputy Inspector General Victor Langley arrived at 8:47 with 2 staff members and a physical file folder that he set on the table without explanation. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with a deliberate way of moving that suggested he had spent many years in rooms where the wrong word at the wrong moment cost someone significantly. He sat down, opened the folder, and looked at the panel that had assembled to hear the case against Mallory, 2 hospital administrators, a legal representative, and Baines himself. "I'd like to understand," Langley said, "how this institution came to initiate disciplinary proceedings against the person who identified a nerve agent exposure in your facility last night, administered the correct counter-protocol, and prevented what would have been multiple fatalities." He said it the way someone asks a question when they already know the answer is going to be unflattering. "Walk me through the reasoning." The hospital's legal representative began to explain about proper authorization channels. Langley let him finish, then set a single page from the folder in the center of the table. It was a summary of Mallory's military record, a declassified summary carefully bounded, but enough to make clear that the woman they had reassigned to Bay 5 to answer for her proficiencies had been performing surgical field interventions in active combat zones before most of the people in this room had finished their residencies. The meeting did not end with a verdict on Mallory's conduct. It ended with Langley informing the panel that the incident at Briarwood Regional had become part of a broader federal inquiry, and that several parties in the room might be receiving follow-up requests in the coming days. Baines left the conference room without speaking to anyone. Mallory went back to Adrian. She sat at the charting station outside Bay 3, where she could see his monitor through the glass, and she began going through something she had pulled from the hospital's internal document system. The night before, a printed copy of the 17 incident reports she had submitted over the past 11 months. She had filed them through the proper channel each time, flagged them for review, and received either a form acknowledgement or nothing at all. At the time, she had told herself that was institutional inefficiency. Standard. Frustrating, but not unusual. She spread the reports across the workstation and started reading them in sequence, which was something she had never done before. She had always filed them as isolated incidents, a shipment of chest tube kits that arrived with 3 units missing from each box, a batch of vasopressor vials that tested below concentration, a set of surgical staples that failed inspection at twice the normal rate. Separate problems, separate reports, separate acknowledgments that disappeared into the system. But reading them together laid out in order, she began to see something that wasn't random. The missing items were never the same thing twice. They were never enough of any single item to trigger a formal supply audit. They were always different enough in category and timing that no one looking at one report would connect it to the next. But reading them as a sequence, Mallory could see the logic underneath the same logic she had been trained to recognize in a different kind of environment. Someone was pulling inventory. Carefully, selectively, in quantities designed to fall beneath the threshold of automated alerts. Not stealing to sell, stealing to accumulate. She thought about the device on Route 17. The way it had been built not just for blast effect, but for dispersion. Whoever had constructed it had needed specific components. Components that wouldn't all be available through a single source without drawing attention. She sat back and looked at the 17 reports, and understood with the particular cold clarity that came from having spent years in environments where patterns meant survival, that she had been documenting a procurement pipeline for nearly a year without knowing what she was looking at. She found Langley at the end of the hallway and told him what she had found, walking him through it methodically. The selection pattern, the timing, the gap between what was ordered, what was paid for, and what had actually arrived. Langley listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he asked her to send him the reports directly. "The contracts," he said. "Do you know whose office they ran through?" She did know. She had seen Baines's name on the authorization lines of 3 of the affected purchase orders when she had cross-referenced them 6 months ago, and she had included that detail in her 7th report. The report that had received no response at all. Langley made a call. By mid-afternoon, the financial picture that his team assembled was substantial. Briarwood Regional had paid out approximately $2.3 million across a series of contracts with a company called Norval Medical Systems payments for equipment that had never arrived incomplete, or arrived substituted with materials that failed basic quality standards. Every contract in the series had been authorized through the trauma department. Every authorization had Baines's signature. What the investigators found when they pulled Baines's personnel history made the financial record feel secondary. When his office was searched, tucked behind the bottom drawer of his desk, in a plain manila folder, investigators found a copy of the 2009 retirement order that had ended his military career, and beside it, a handwritten list of names. Some had lines drawn through them. Some didn't. Baines had not joined Norval's network because he needed money, though he had taken the money. He had joined because someone had offered him the thing he actually wanted, a way to damage the institution that had discarded him. The contracts were his method. The missing inventory was his contribution, and the device on Route 17 was the result. That was the moment the investigation stopped being about a hospital. Mallory was standing at Adrian's bedside when the monitor alarm cut through the quiet of Bay 3. His heart rhythm, which had been holding at an unstable but manageable rate, collapsed without warning into ventricular fibrillation, a chaotic, ineffective quivering that produced no real cardiac output. On the screen, the ordered waves she had been watching for hours dissolved into a jagged, purposeless line. She had the crash cart moving before Tyler Marsh had fully registered what he was seeing. She called the code herself, charged the defibrillators to the correct joule setting, and delivered the shock in one continuous motion that had no wasted steps in it. Adrian's body responded. The rhythm returned, stunned, slow, but organized. She held her position watching, and then called for Dr. Simon Kessler, a toxicologist, who had been consulting on the chemical exposure cases since the previous night. Kessler arrived in 4 minutes. He was in his early 40s, methodical, and he had the useful quality of not needing a situation explained twice. Mallory briefed him on Adrian's full case while she prepared a maintenance infusion, and Kessler absorbed it and began cross-referencing it against the toxicological data he had been building on the other affected soldiers. The compound did cardiac damage, Kessler said, studying the most recent rhythm strip. The conduction system took a hit. He needs the antidote from Fort Redmond. The standard formulary here isn't going to be sufficient. How long? They're transporting it now. 3 hours, maybe less. 3 hours was a long time to keep a compromised heart from failing again, and both of them knew it. Mallory did not leave the bay. It was while she was standing there watching Adrian breathe that the full shape of it settled into place. The first convoy accident on Route 17 hadn't been random. The timing was too precise, a mass casualty event that filled Briarwood Regional's trauma bays the same week Baines had a reason to move Mallory out of them. Nolan's complaint had landed at exactly the right moment to justify pulling her credentials in the lead-up to a second, far more dangerous incident. If the complaint had held, if the disciplinary review had suspended her before that second convoy arrived, there would have been no one in this building who could have recognized an organophosphate exposure pattern. Adrian and the others would have been treated for blast injuries and declined and died before anyone understood what they were actually dying from. Mallory didn't know whether Nolan had understood what he was being used for. She suspected not. He had the look of a man who had been handed a narrative that confirmed something he already believed and had not asked enough questions about where that narrative came from. That didn't absolve him. His contempt had been real. His willingness to act on it without hesitation had been real. But the person who had handed him that narrative had known exactly what they were doing and had counted on his certainty to do the rest. She set her hand on the bed rail and looked at Adrian's face, a man she didn't know, who had come through a door that someone had built specifically for him to die behind. And she understood that none of what had happened in the past 48 hours had been about her at all. She had simply been the variable someone needed to eliminate. The one person in the building whose background made her dangerous to a plan that had been running quietly and carefully for a very long time. Outside Bay 3, Langley's team was still working. The phones were ringing. Somewhere across town, a warrant was being signed. Mallory stayed where she was and watched the monitor and waited for the medication from Fort Redmond. The medication from Fort Redmond arrived 2 hours and 41 minutes after Kessler made the call. Mallory had not left Bay 3 in that time. She had adjusted Adrian's maintenance infusion twice, managed 2 runs of unstable rhythm that hadn't crossed back into fibrillation, but had come close enough to keep her standing rather than sitting, and updated Tyler Marsh on every change so that his documentation was airtight. When the transport courier came through the doors with the cooler from Fort Redmond, Mallory had the administration protocol already written out and verified against Kessler's notes. Kessler arrived minutes later, and they worked through the antidote together without needing to discuss the division of labor. He handled the concentration calculations while she managed the line and the timing, and Adrian's body, which had been fighting against itself for the better part of 20 hours, began very slowly to stop fighting. The tremors quieted. The rhythm on the monitor settled into something that looked for the first time like it might hold. Kessler watched the readout for a long moment, and then said, "I think he's going to make it." Mallory wrote the time in the margin of her notes. She didn't say anything, but something in her shoulders that had been held at a specific tension for the past several hours released by a degree that was not quite visible to anyone watching. Down the hall, the investigation had not slowed while she was in the bay. Langley's team had spent the afternoon building a timeline that connected the 17 incident reports to the Norval contracts to the components recovered from the Route 17 device. The connection was not circumstantial, it was architectural. The missing inventory from Briarwood Regional's trauma supply chain, pulled over 11 months in quantities engineered to avoid automated audits, matched precisely against the material components identified by the ordnance team at Fort Redmond. Someone had known what they needed and had known how to take it without being noticed. What they had not planned for was a nurse who filed paperwork about everything and read it again later in sequence. Colonel Barrett coordinated with Fort Redmond on the tactical side, and what that coordination produced was confirmation that the first convoy accident on Route 17 had not been accidental. The skid patterns at the scene were inconsistent with the road conditions and the vehicle speeds recorded by the convoy's onboard data system. The leading vehicle had been forced to brake hard by something that was no longer present when investigators arrived, removed deliberately in the window between the accident and the arrival of the state police. A staged event executed with the kind of precision that required inside knowledge of the convoy's route and schedule. That information went to Langley, who added it to a federal warrant application that was already 3 inches thick. Nolan Gresham was transported to Fort Redmond for questioning late that afternoon. Mallory wasn't in the room when they came for him, and she didn't ask for a report on how it went. What she had concluded about Nolan was what she still believed, that he had almost certainly been fed a version of events designed to activate the specific kind of certainty that men like him were prone to. But being manipulated and being responsible were not the same category, and no one had forced him to file the complaint or to stand in a trauma bay and laugh at a nurse while a man's oxygen levels fell. Those had been his choices, made freely from a posture of contempt that he had carried into the room before anyone handed him a narrative. By the following morning, Baines's office had been searched and sealed. His phone and personal laptop were in federal custody. Dr. Malcolm Dwyer submitted his resignation before the business day was formally underway, issuing a written statement through the hospital's legal department that cited personal reasons and said nothing else. 3 Norval executives were identified in the warrant. 2 of them were taken into custody that afternoon. The third was located the following day at an address in another state. A second shipment components that had been staged for transport, but not yet moved, was seized from a storage unit registered to a shell company with a mailing address in a strip mall outside Alder Ridge. The forensic accountants who went through Norval's records over the following weeks would eventually calculate that the full operation had been running for just under 4 years, operating across 2 military-adjacent hospitals in different states, with Briarwood Regional as its most active node. The $2.3 million that had passed through Baines's authorization lines was one portion of a larger figure that the federal indictment would enumerate in full. Baines was charged with procurement fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to facilitate an illegal supply chain operation. His medical license was suspended the same week. He did not make a statement. His attorney made one on his behalf, which was short and said very little. Mallory read the summary in a 2-paragraph news item on a local outlet's website, and then set her phone down and went back to work. 2 weeks after the night the antidote arrived from Fort Redmond, a man in civilian clothes came through the main entrance of Briarwood Regional and asked the front desk to let Mallory Keene know he was there. She came down to the first-floor waiting area and found Nolan Gresham sitting in one of the chairs near the window, wearing jeans and a gray jacket, without rank or uniform, or the 2 soldiers who had flanked him the first time she'd seen him. He stood when she approached, and the posture he held was entirely different from the one she remembered, not smaller exactly, but without the forward lean of a man who expects the room to accommodate him. "I don't have a speech," he said. "I thought about writing something down, but it felt like I was making it easier on myself." Mallory sat down across from him. She didn't tell him it was fine or that he didn't need to do this. It wasn't fine, and he did need to do it. "I filed that complaint because I was angry," Nolan said. "And I was angry because someone told me you had misrepresented your qualifications and put my teammate at risk, and I believed it without asking a single question about where that information came from." He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "I walked into that trauma bay, and I saw your badge, and I decided that was all I needed to know. Everything after that was just me acting on something I'd already decided." He withdrew the complaint withdrawal form from the inside pocket of his jacket, already signed, already dated, and set it on the seat beside him. "I'm sorry, Mallory. Not just for being wrong about the facts, for the kind of person I was when I walked through that door." It was a long time since someone had apologized to Mallory in a way that didn't also ask her to do something with the apology, to accept it quickly, to reassure them, to make the exchange feel resolved so they could leave feeling lighter. Nolan wasn't doing that. He was sitting with it, which told her that whatever the weeks since Route 17 had cost him, they had cost him something real. "You were easy to use," she said, "because the contempt was already there. You didn't need to be convinced of much. Someone handed you a reason to act on what you already thought, and you took it." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to tell you that you're a bad person. I don't know you well enough for that." What I know is that someone almost died in that bay because you were standing between me and the patient, and the reason you were so easy to put there is something you're going to have to decide what to do with." She picked up the form and held it. "Don't let it happen again. Not to me, not to anyone else in a room where it matters." Nolan nodded. He didn't offer anything further, and she didn't ask him to. He stood, and she stood, and he walked back toward the entrance with the particular gait of a man who had not been let off the hook, but had been given something he could work with, which was the only kind of mercy that meant anything. Mallory went back upstairs. 3 weeks after that, Adrian Rourke came through the same entrance with his wife, Grace, a woman who had the look of someone who had not slept well for a sustained period, and was only now beginning to believe she could again. Adrian was moving carefully, the way people move when they've been reminded that their body is something they're borrowing, but he was upright, and his color was good, and his eyes were clear. His 12-year-old daughter had sent a card. He handed it to Mallory in the hallway outside Bay 3, a folded piece of construction paper with a drawing on the front. A figure in scrubs with a stethoscope, rendered in the confident, uncomplicated lines of a kid who drew what she meant without worrying about proportion. Inside, in careful handwriting, "Thank you for saving my dad." Mallory held the card for a moment and then folded it along its original crease and put it in the pocket of her scrubs. Adrian shook her hand and said the things people say when they don't have adequate language for what they're trying to express, and Grace said "thank you" twice, and then pressed her lips together and didn't say anything else because there wasn't anything else that fit. Mallory told them both that she was glad he was standing there, and she meant it in the exact and literal sense, no elaboration, no performance, just the fact of the thing. The meeting with Briarwood Regional's executive leadership happened the following week. The hospital's chief administrator and 2 members of the board were present along with their legal counsel. The administrator began with a formal written apology read aloud from a prepared statement, and then offered Mallory a newly created position, senior clinical advisor, with a mandate to rebuild the hospital's mass casualty response protocols and chemical exposure preparedness from the ground up. It was by any measure a significant role, more authority, a different kind of visibility, the kind of position that would have required her to step forward in a way she had spent 11 months actively avoiding. She accepted it, not because she wanted the title or the formal acknowledgement, though she understood why the institution felt it needed to make both gestures. She accepted it because she had spent 11 months filing reports that disappeared and watching a department run by a man who had weaponized his authority to protect something that was actively causing harm, and because she now knew exactly what the consequences of that looked like when they arrived at a hospital in the back of an ambulance. If she could build something here, a system where the nurses who saw problems first had a real mechanism for escalating them, where a report filed on a Tuesday didn't vanish by Wednesday, where the person with the most experience in the room wasn't required to wait for permission from the person with the most impressive title, then the decision to stay mattered in a way that going back to Bay 5 never would. She kept her apartment. She kept the morning run, 6 miles, same route, before the sun was fully up. She kept her name badge, which still listed her as staff rather than administration, because she had requested it, and the administrator had looked at her for a moment, and then agreed without pushing back. She was still a clinician first. Everything else was infrastructure. The first protocol she wrote was for chemical exposure triage. The second was for anonymous incident reporting with a direct escalation path that bypassed departmental approval. The third was a training framework for recognizing supply chain anomalies, built around the 17 reports she had filed over the past year, and the pattern she had learned to see only when she looked at all of them together. One evening, walking back through the main corridor, after finishing the third document, she passed a room where a patient was sitting alone, visibly afraid, not of anything specific, just of the room and the equipment and the particular quality of silence that settles over a person when the medical system has placed them somewhere and left them to wait. Mallory recognized that silence. She had seen it in different settings, under different circumstances, but it always looked the same. She went in and pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. The patient looked at her and said, "You don't have to stay." "I know," Mallory said. She stayed. Mallory never needed anyone to know who she had been. She just needed to be in the room when it mattered. And that's the thing about people like her, they're already out there. In emergency rooms, in schools, in the background of every crisis you've ever heard about. Doing the work quietly, filing the reports, no one reads, making the call no one else will make. The next time you cross paths with someone like that, someone whose badge doesn't seem to match what they're capable of, maybe hold your judgment a little longer than feels comfortable. If this story made you think or made you feel something worth keeping, subscribe to this channel. We tell stories about people who don't ask to be seen because those are the ones worth paying attention to. We'll see you in the next one.